History Secrets.
The history of great powers is rarely determined only by external wars. Often, the fate of a nation depends on something much deeper, on how it organizes its own society, and on which values it chooses to place at the center of its collective identity. According to a controversial interpretation presented in some recent geopolitical debates, Russia faces exactly this kind of dilemma, a civilizational dilemma, a choice between two models of society. On one side, the consumer model, on the other, the warrior model. In this interpretation, modern consumerism creates a highly comfortable society, but also a deeply passive one. Individuals begin to organize their lives around comfort, entertainment, and material prosperity. Buying, traveling, consuming, seeking individual security. This social structure creates stability, but it can also reduce the willingness for collective sacrifice. Within this logic, a radical critique emerges. An excessively consumerist society may lose its capacity for mobilization. When existential crises arise, its citizens may hesitate to defend the system, or simply prefer to preserve their own comfort. It is at this point that the concept of the high warrior emerges. The warrior represents a completely different mindset. It is not just about a soldier, but about an individual who believes they can shape the course of history. An individual willing to sacrifice personal comfort for collective goals. Within this view, war begins to play a social function, a disciplining function, a way to create national cohesion, structure, meaning, purpose. Some supporters of this interpretation argue that conflicts can strengthen certain aspects of a society. They mobilize resources, create unity, and impose collective discipline. War, in this sense, ceases to be only an instrument of territorial conquest, and begins to be seen as a mechanism of social transformation. This perspective is often associated with what some analysts call Putinism, an idea according to which Russia should organize itself as a warrior civilization, in opposition to the Western liberal model. In this model, continuous war is not only an external strategy, but also an internal instrument, a mechanism to revitalize society. This view suggests that controlled and localized conflicts could discipline a nation. Small wars, regional conflicts, limited military operations. All of this would serve to keep society mobilized, without causing total destruction. According to this interpretation, large-scale wars would be too dangerous, especially in a world with nuclear weapons. Therefore, the focus would be on regional conflicts, limited, manageable, conflicts capable of mobilizing society, without triggering global catastrophes. This idea, however, raises a series of questions. First, if a society constantly depends on war to maintain cohesion, it may enter a dangerous cycle. The economy begins to revolve around conflict. Politics becomes dependent on military mobilization, and internal stability becomes increasingly tied to the existence of external enemies. This type of system can become self-sustaining, but also extremely unstable, because every war requires resources. Financial resources, human resources, industrial resources. Over time, the accumulated cost can become enormous, and this can generate a dynamic similar to a pyramid scheme. Each conflict requires new resources, and these resources often need to be obtained through new expansions, new wars, new territories. History offers clear examples of this process. Nazi Germany, for example, expanded its territory through successive military campaigns. Each conquest provided temporary resources, but also required new expansions to sustain the system. This cycle ultimately led to a devastating global conflict. Another important issue involves political leadership. A highly militarized society usually depends on central figures of authority, leaders capable of keeping different groups united, controlling generals, and coordinating national mobilization. But this structure has a weak point: succession. What happens when an extremely dominant leader disappears? Who takes control? And how to prevent internal disputes between military or political factions? This question becomes especially relevant in highly centralized political systems, when much of the stability depends on the authority of a single figure. The absence of this leader can open space for internal conflicts, rivalries among elites, or even fragmentation of the state. For this reason, some analysts argue that the greatest weakness of systems based on personalist leadership is precisely the post-leadership future. When a strong leader is in power, unity may appear solid, but when they disappear, accumulated tensions may quickly emerge. In the case of contemporary Russia, this issue frequently appears in strategic discussions. The current political system is deeply associated with the figure of Vladimir Putin. His authority, experience, and control over political elites play a central role in the regime's stability. But history shows that no leader remains forever, and when political systems depend excessively on a single figure, the transition of power can become extremely delicate. This type of transition has already produced serious crises in various countries throughout history. This does not necessarily mean that collapse is inevitable. States can develop institutions capable of managing succession, creating mechanisms of continuity, and avoiding internal disputes. But the more personalist a political system is, the greater the risk tends to be during moments of transition. Perhaps that is why the central question about Russia's future remains open. Can a society based on permanent mobilization sustain long-term stability? Or does this structure inevitably create internal tensions that are difficult to control? The answer is still not clear. But one thing is certain. Just as has happened with other powers throughout history, the true test of a political system rarely occurs at the height of its power. It occurs during transitions, during moments of change, during periods in which new leadership must assume responsibility. And it is precisely in these moments that the fate of a nation can be redefined. To fully understand this theory about so-called Putinism, it is necessary to look more closely at the internal logic of this thinking. Because in this interpretation, war ceases to be only an instrument of foreign policy. It begins to be seen as a mechanism of social engineering, a tool capable of transforming the very nature of a society. The central idea is relatively radical. Modern societies based on consumption tend to become passive. Individuals begin to organize their lives around personal comfort, career, entertainment, economic stability. All of this creates prosperity, but it can also reduce the willingness for collective sacrifice. According to this reading, this type of society may lose its ability to face existential crises. When confronted with external threats, the individual's priority tends to be preserving their own safety, not defending the collective system. This is exactly where the concept of the Ig warrior emerges. The warrior represents the opposite of the consumer. They do not live only for themselves. They believe their actions can influence the destiny of their nation. They accept risks, accept sacrifices, and, in extreme cases, even accept death in the name of a collective purpose. To illustrate this logic, some thinkers use thought experiments. Imagine a group of people isolated in a hostile environment. An island, for example. In that place, everyone faces a common threat. A threat capable of destroying the entire group. In this type of situation, individual rivalries quickly disappear. People begin to cooperate, work together, defend one another. Danger creates unity. Within this logic, war can function as a social catalyst. It imposes discipline, creates structures of cooperation, and generates a strong sense of collective purpose. Even death acquires symbolic meaning. The individual who dies in combat may be remembered as a hero, as someone who sacrificed their life for the good of the community. This way of thinking is not new. Throughout history, many civilizations have deeply valued the ideal of the warrior. Sparta, Rome, various medieval societies. In all these cases, war played a central role in social organization. However, this view also contains deep contradictions, because a society permanently mobilized for war faces enormous challenges. First, the economic cost. Maintaining a war economy requires massive resources, industries dedicated to military production, large contingents of soldiers, constant investment in armaments. Second, the human cost. Even limited wars generate losses. Dead soldiers, affected families, impacted communities. Over time, these costs can accumulate. Third, the risk of escalation. Wars rarely remain perfectly controlled. Local conflicts can expand. Alliances can be activated. Regional rivalries can intensify. This risk has become even more serious in the nuclear era. Today, major powers possess arsenals capable of destroying entire civilizations. For this reason, direct conflicts between nuclear powers are considered extremely dangerous. An uncontrolled escalation could have catastrophic consequences for the planet. That is why some modern strategies seek to limit wars to regional conflicts. Small conflicts, localized, manageable, conflicts that can be controlled without triggering chain reactions. But even this type of strategy contains risks, because each war generates new tensions, new resentments, new cycles of rivalry. In addition, there is another important contradiction within the very idea of a warrior society. A militarized society may produce disciplined and mobilized citizens, but it can also create extremely powerful armed forces. And powerful armed forces have their own political dynamics. Soldiers trained to fight, generals accustomed to exercising authority, highly organized military institutions. These elements can represent a significant political force within a country. Historically, many militarized societies have faced this problem. When the army becomes the dominant institution, it may begin to compete for power with civilian leadership. Coups, military rebellions, internal struggles for control of government. These events appear repeatedly throughout history. This contradiction raises a crucial question. Can a society based on permanent military mobilization remain politically stable? Or does it inevitably create internal forces that are difficult to control? This question becomes even more complex when we consider the factor of leadership. Highly centralized political systems often depend on the authority of a dominant leader, a leader capable of balancing different power groups, controlling political elites, and maintaining discipline within military institutions. While this leader remains in power, the system may appear solid. But when they disappear, the situation can change rapidly. Rival factions may emerge, internal conflicts may erupt, and political structures may fragment. For this reason, many analysts consider leadership succession one of the most delicate moments for any political regime, especially highly personalist regimes. In these systems, authority is not distributed across stable institutions. It is concentrated in a single person. When that person disappears, an inevitable question arises: who takes control? And how to prevent the struggle for power from destroying the system itself? In the case of contemporary Russia, this issue frequently appears in geopolitical analyses. Current political stability is deeply linked to the leadership of Vladimir Putin. His authority has been consolidated over decades. His influence extends across military, political, and economic institutions. But no leader remains in power indefinitely. And when that phase comes to an end, Russia will face a decisive moment. A moment that may define the country's future for many decades. If institutions are strong enough, the transition may occur relatively smoothly. But if the system depends excessively on individual leadership, accumulated tensions may emerge forcefully. This is, perhaps, the real question behind all these theories. Not only the future of Russia, but the fate of any highly centralized political system. Because, in the end, the most difficult test of a regime never occurs at the peak of its power. It occurs during succession. If we provisionally accept this interpretation of so-called Putinism, then an even deeper question arises: whether war can truly function as a mechanism of social renewal, or whether, in the long run, it inevitably destroys what it tries to preserve. This doubt appears repeatedly throughout history. Civilizations that organized themselves around war often achieved enormous military power, but also faced constant cycles of instability. The logic of the warrior society starts from a simple observation. When a community faces a common danger, its internal divisions decrease. Political differences, social conflicts, regional rivalries, all of this tends to be temporarily suspended. Collective survival becomes the priority. This phenomenon has long been known. During major wars, entire populations often demonstrate extraordinary levels of cooperation. Industries reorganize. Citizens accept sacrifices. Governments expand their authority. The entire country enters a state of mobilization. In this sense, war can indeed create cohesion. It can generate discipline. It can produce a powerful sense of collective purpose. But this same process also has a dangerous side, because societies permanently organized around war tend to develop extremely rigid structures. The economy becomes dependent on military production. Politics becomes dependent on permanent mobilization. And the entire system begins to require constant conflicts to sustain itself. This dynamic can create a cycle that is difficult to break. If the economy depends on war, if national identity depends on war, if political legitimacy depends on war, then peace can become a problem. Historically, this type of structure has led some regimes to seek successive conflicts. Each victory required new objectives. Each mobilization required new enemies. And each expansion created new unstable frontiers. It was exactly this type of logic that led some empires to expand continuously. Rome during certain periods of its history, Germany during the Nazi regime, other powers that pursued constant territorial growth. But this strategy almost always encountered limits. Resources are exhausted, populations grow tired, and external resistance begins to increase. For this reason, many historians describe prolonged expansionist wars as unstable systems. They may function for some time, but often end up creating internal crises or devastating external confrontations. In the case of contemporary Russia, some analysts raise exactly this concern. If a society organizes itself around permanent mobilization, it may face increasing pressure over time. Economic pressure, demographic pressure, political pressure. Another important element involves the nature of the modern economy. Prolonged wars require enormous amounts of resources: energy, metals, technology, industrial production. Maintaining a militarized economy can generate temporary growth, but it can also divert investments from essential civilian sectors: education, infrastructure, technological innovation. In addition, there is the demographic issue. Prolonged conflicts tend to especially affect younger populations: soldiers, workers, families. Over decades, this impact can profoundly alter a country's social structure. These factors raise a central strategic question. Can a society based on constant military mobilization remain competitive in a highly technological and economically interdependent world? Or does it risk gradually isolating itself? This question becomes even more complex when we consider the current international scenario. The world is slowly moving toward a multipolar system. Multiple centers of power are emerging simultaneously. United States, China, European Union, Russia, other regional powers. In this type of system, direct conflicts between major powers become extremely dangerous, especially due to the existence of nuclear arsenals. For this reason, disputes often occur in direct levels: regional influence, technology, economy, information. This reality can severely limit strategies based on constant military confrontation, because each local conflict carries the risk of escalation, and any escalation between nuclear powers can have unpredictable consequences. But there is still one final element in this equation: leadership succession. As discussed earlier, highly personalist political systems often face difficulties when a dominant leader leaves power. Institutions must assume responsibility. New leaders must emerge. Internal balances must be rebuilt. If these transitions are poorly managed, internal rivalries may arise. Political factions, conflicts among elites, disputes between institutions. In extreme cases, the state itself may fragment. This type of scenario has occurred at various moments throughout history, especially in regimes where much of the stability depended on the personal authority of a leader. For this reason, some analysts argue that the true test of any political system does not occur during its period of greatest power. It occurs during transition, when the central leader disappears, when new forces begin to compete for influence, when the future of the system must be redefined. If institutions are solid, the system can survive. If they are weak, the transition can become turbulent. In the case of Russia, these questions remain open. No one knows exactly how the political system will evolve in the coming decades. But one thing is certain: history repeatedly shows that the fate of a nation is rarely determined only by external wars. It depends above all on how that society organizes its own power. And that is precisely why debates about ideologies, such as so-called I-Putinism, continue to generate so much interest among geopolitical analysts. Because, in the end, these ideas are not only about Russia. They reflect a much broader debate about the role of war, about the nature of modern societies, and about how nations try to find meaning and purpose in an increasingly uncertain world. Perhaps it is precisely at this point that this discussion becomes most relevant to you. It forces us to ask, what kind of society do we want to build? A society based on consumption, or a society permanently mobilized for conflict? And this question, sooner or later, ends up reaching all nations. If we take this theory to its ultimate consequences, we arrive at an unsettling conclusion. A society permanently organized around war needs something essential to function: central authority, strong leadership, a figure capable of directing collective energy. Without this figure, the very logic of permanent mobilization can turn against the system. Historically, highly militarized societies have almost always depended on very powerful leaders: kings, emperors, dominant generals, figures capable of controlling different power groups, especially the military itself. Because when an entire society organizes itself around a warrior logic, military power becomes immense. Armed soldiers, experienced generals, highly disciplined military institutions. This type of structure can be a great external force, but it can also represent an internal risk. If there is no unquestionable central authority, different factions may begin to compete for control. Generals may compete with one another. Political elites may try to capture power. and the system may fragment rapidly. This is a classic problem in societies based on warrior culture. As long as a strong leader exists, unity may appear solid. But when that leader disappears, accumulated tensions can explode. History records numerous examples of this phenomenon. Empires that remained stable for decades under a dominant leader, but entered internal conflict shortly after their death. It is precisely here that what some analysts consider the greatest vulnerability of the contemporary Russian political system emerges: the issue of succession. The current system of power in Russia was shaped over many years under the leadership of Vladimir Putin. His political authority, his control over institutions, and his ability to balance different elites play a central role in the regime's stability. But no leader remains forever. And when a central figure dominates the system for a long time, succession becomes a particularly delicate moment. Who takes control? How to maintain unity among different centers of power? How to avoid disputes between military, political, and economic factions? According to some analyses, this may be the true structural weakness of contemporary Russia. Not necessarily its economy, nor its army, but the future after the current leadership. If an entire society is organized around permanent mobilization for conflict, that mobilization requires direction, coordination, discipline. Without this, powerful military forces may begin to act independently. Generals may dispute authority. Regions may seek autonomy, and the state itself may face centrifugal pressures. In highly centralized systems, this type of transition can be particularly dangerous, because institutions are often not designed to operate without the dominant figure that held them together. This concern is not exclusive to Russia. It appears in many political systems throughout history, whenever much of the stability depends on the authority of a single leader. When that leader disappears, two things can happen. If strong institutions exist, the transition may occur relatively smoothly. But if the system is excessively personalist, internal disputes may emerge rapidly. Some analysts argue that societies organized around permanent military mobilization face exactly this dilemma. They need strong leaders. But very strong leaders can weaken independent institutions. And when those leaders disappear, the system may lack clear mechanisms of succession. This paradox is at the center of many discussions about Russia's future. On one hand, the current leadership managed to restore stability after the chaos of the 1990s, reorganized institutions, strengthened state power, and consolidated a more assertive national identity. On the other hand, the more a system identifies with a single leadership, the more complex its future transition may become. And this moment of transition may define the destiny of a country for generations. This does not necessarily mean that collapse is inevitable. States can adapt their institutions, create mechanisms of succession, and ensure political continuity. But the more centralized a system is, the greater the challenge tends to be. For this reason, some analysts suggest that the true test of so-called Putinism has not yet occurred. It will not occur during the peak of mobilization, nor during external conflicts. It will occur at the moment when the current leadership leaves power. It will be at that moment that it will become clear whether the system has built institutions capable of surviving beyond a single leader, or whether internal tensions will begin to emerge. This question remains unanswered, because history is still unfolding, and Russia's future will depend not only on wars or geopolitical disputes, but also on how its own political system will evolve in the coming years. Perhaps this is the final lesson of this entire discussion. Great powers are not defined only by their military strength. They are defined by their ability to manage power over time, especially in the most delicate moments of transition. And it is precisely in these moments that the fate of a nation can change completely. Each historical discovery reveals new clues, but also raises new questions. Because when it comes to the past, there is always something we still do not understand. Because some secrets of history are still waiting to be revealed.